The most reproduced line in the entire Hermetic corpus is being quoted by millions of people who have no idea what the text says next. And what comes next is precisely what Hermes warned would be forgotten during the exact phase of history we are in right now. Everyone knows the phrase. Almost nobody knows what it was introducing. What comes after it changes everything about what the phrase means and what it demands of the person who truly understands it. This video is about the complete text, the part that was preserved, the part that was quietly set aside, and what the full map reveals about where we are, what is happening, and what you are supposed to do with that knowledge right now. Before we go any further, if this kind of knowledge speaks to you, subscribe to the channel. This is where we keep building on this work together. And what comes next in this series goes much further than this one line has been allowed to go. The Emerald Tablet is not a collection of quotable lines. It is a 13-line text that describes a complete operational system. How consciousness descends into matter, how it operates within matter, and how it ascends back out of it. The line that everyone quotes, "As above, so below, as within, so without, as the universe, so the soul," is the second line of that text. There are 11 more lines that follow it, and those 11 lines describe the mechanism that makes line 2 mean anything at all. Without the mechanism, the phrase becomes decoration. With the mechanism, it becomes a map. Most people have been handed the phrase without the map. This video gives you the map. Descent, operation within matter, ascent back through the spheres, 3 phases, each with specific conditions, specific obstacles, specific instructions, not poetic imagery, not spiritual aesthetics. The Emerald Tablet was preserved by the alchemical tradition, copied in Arabic, translated into Latin, annotated by Isaac Newton, who found in it not metaphor, but what he called the foundation of a complete system of natural philosophy. What Newton saw in the text was not a spiritual affirmation, but an operational description of how reality is structured and navigated. This is the architecture of the full Hermetic map, and it begins with the phrase everyone knows and continues into territory almost nobody has been shown. Why did line 2 become the only line that most people ever encounter? The answer to that question is not accidental, and it is, in a way that will become precise as this video continues, part of what the text itself predicted. The Hermetic tradition describes a cycle in which the most operationally useful knowledge is the first to disappear from general circulation during specific phases of that cycle. Not because it was destroyed, because the conditions of those phases make depth unpopular, surface desirable, and a fragment far easier to share than a complete map. Line 2 survived because it is beautiful and fits on a poster. What comes after it survived too, but in different hands. Something brought you to this video. You already know the phrase. You have probably seen it attached to everything from wellness content to high school philosophy classes to tattoos. And somewhere in the process of encountering it everywhere, you may have felt that something was missing, that a line this widely distributed should carry more weight than it seems to in most of the contexts where it appears. That sensation was accurate. The phrase is not missing weight. The context that gives it weight has been quietly left out. What you are about to receive is not a new interpretation. It is the text that was always there, waiting to be read in full. The Corpus Hermeticum is a collection of 17 texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, a figure the ancient world described as the synthesis of the Egyptian god Thoth and the Greek god Hermes, simultaneously the keeper of sacred knowledge and the messenger between worlds. The texts, as we have them today, traveled through a specific verifiable chain, composed in Greco-Egyptian Alexandria, translated into Arabic by scholars including Jabir ibn Hayyan in the 9th century, then translated into Latin by Marsilio Ficino in 1463 for Cosimo de' Medici, who, according to historical record, ordered Ficino to stop translating Plato and begin on the Hermetic texts immediately, because something in what he had seen made him treat it as urgent. The corpus is not mythology. It is a mapped system, and the Emerald Tablet is the compressed version of the map's core sequence, the same sequence that the corpus develops across 17 dialogues. What the mystery schools understood about this phrase, the knowledge that the Hermetic tradition preserved across multiple civilizations, but that the modern quotation culture has completely lost, is that, as above, so below, is not a statement about the beauty of correspondence. It is a navigational instruction. It is the Hermetic equivalent of a compass bearing. It tells you that the structure of what you cannot see directly mirrors the structure of what you can observe, and therefore that by studying what is visible with sufficient precision, you can map what is invisible. And by learning to move the invisible, you move the visible. That is not mysticism. That is the operational claim of the Hermetic tradition, stated in the second line of the Emerald Tablet, and developed in complete technical detail in the 11 lines that follow it. If what we're unfolding here is landing with you as more than a quote, if it's landing as a map, write in the comments right now. The map is complete. 3 words that signal to yourself and to the algorithm that you are reading this from the inside. The Poimandres is the first dialogue of the Corpus Hermeticum and the text that most directly develops what the Emerald Tablet describes in compressed form. In the Poimandres, the figure of Nous, the divine mind, the highest principle of consciousness, descends through 7 concentric spheres on its way into material existence. Each sphere imprints a quality onto the descending consciousness. From the outermost, it receives things like desire and illusion, possessiveness, arrogance, cunning without wisdom. By the time it arrives in the material world, the consciousness has accumulated these layers like garments over its original nature. The Poimandres does not describe this as punishment. It describes it as a specific phase of a cycle. A phase with a beginning, a middle, and a defined path of return. The descent is not the story. The map back is the story. 7 spheres, 7 qualities accumulated on the way down, and, this is the part the tradition preserved with particular care, 7 qualities to be surrendered, one by one, on the way back up. The Poimandres describes this return explicitly. At the first zone, he gives up the power of increase and decrease. At the second, evil device and artifice. At the third, the deceitful lust. At the fourth, the commanding arrogance. At the fifth, rash daring. At the sixth, the strivings after wealth. At the 7th zone, the lurking lie. This is not a list of sins. It is a sequence of releases. The text is describing what the consciousness sheds at each stage of its return to what it originally was. As above, so below. The ascent mirrors the descent in reverse. That is the operational meaning of line 2, and it is only legible when you know what comes next. The phase the Poimandres calls the period of deepest material immersion is described with a precision that is, once you read it, difficult to misidentify. Consciousness at its deepest point of descent does not recognize what it is. It identifies completely with the material world, with the layers it has accumulated, with the desires and illusions it picked up on the way down. It treats the images it encounters as reality and the reality it cannot perceive as irrelevant. Hermes does not describe this as a moral failure. He describes it as a mechanical condition of the cycle. It is what happens when consciousness is maximally embedded in the material sphere. The person in this condition is not wicked. They are disoriented. The map they need has been set aside. If you have ever watched someone completely absorbed in surface, in performance, in image, in what things look like rather than what they are, and felt a specific kind of distance, not judgment, but a recognition that something is missing from their orientation, you are experiencing what Hermes describes as the perception of someone who is moving through the cycle differently. That distance is not superiority. In the Hermetic framework, it is a diagnostic signal. The Poimandres describes those who retain some orientation toward their original nature as able to perceive the condition of those who have lost it entirely. What is important is what you do with that perception. And that is precisely what the second half of the corpus was preserved to address. The Asclepius is a different kind of Hermetic text. While the Poimandres operates primarily as cosmological dialogue, mapping the structure of consciousness and its movement through the spheres, the Asclepius includes what scholars of the Hermetic tradition have called the Lament of Hermes, a passage in which the teacher addresses his student Asclepius directly about what will happen to the sacred knowledge being transmitted between them. It is one of the most specific pieces of predictive writing in the ancient world, and it is almost never cited in the same breath as above, so below. The reason for that omission is worth examining carefully, because the lament is not separate from the map. It is the part of the map that describes the territory you are currently standing in. The standard reading of the lament treats it as an expression of Hermes's grief over the decline of Egyptian religious culture, a lament for a specific historical moment that has come and gone. That reading is incomplete in a way that is structurally similar to quoting line 2 of the Emerald Tablet without reading lines 3 through 13. The lament describes a cycle, not a singular event. And this is the part that is almost never quoted. It does not end with the darkness. The Asclepius continues past the lament into what Hermes calls the apokatastasis, the restoration. God, who is Father and Lord, will deliver the world from this corruption, the text says, using language that is not theological, but mechanical. The same divine principle that generates the cycle completes the cycle. The descent and the ascent are governed by the same law. As above, so below. If this is resonating with you, if this kind of knowledge is speaking to you, let me know by liking this video. It helps more people find this content at the right moment. Here is what the Lament of Hermes describes as the characteristics of the phase of maximum darkness, not as prediction of a single moment, but as a map of a recurring condition. It describes a time when sacred places are filled with tombs rather than with the divine, when the holy will be considered laughable by those who cannot perceive it, when the words used to describe spiritual reality will be emptied of their meaning and replaced with performance, when appearances are preferred to substance and the surface of things, their image, their form, their observable exterior, becomes the primary object of attention and desire. Hermes enumerates these not as lamentations, but as descriptors. He is drawing a portrait of what the cycle looks like at its deepest point, so that those who encounter the portrait will know where they are on the map. Performance over substance, image over reality, surface over depth, volume over content. Hermes is not describing this as a moral problem. He is describing it as a mechanical condition, the inevitable consequence of consciousness at maximum immersion in the material sphere. What makes this passage remarkable is not its darkness, but its precision. These are not vague gestures towards spiritual decline. They are specific, observable characteristics that function as coordinates on the map that the full Hermetic text provides. When you can verify the coordinates against what you observe around you, you know your position in the cycle, and knowing your position is the first requirement of navigation. Without it, every effort you make is made in the wrong direction. This is the distinction that changes everything about how to hold what is happening in 2026, the difference between pessimism and a map. Pessimism describes a final state. A map describes a phase. Pessimism offers no instruction. A map offers instruction at every point, including the most difficult ones. The lament of Hermes is not pessimism. It is a description of one specific phase of a cycle that, by the mechanical law the text describes, will complete itself. The darkness is not permanent. It is a structural maximum, the furthest point the pendulum swings in one direction before the law of rhythm that Hermes described elsewhere in the tradition brings it back. This is not consolation. This is the operational claim of the Hermetic map, and it is testable against the historical record. And the part of the lament that nobody quotes is the sentence that follows the darkness. God, who is the Father and Lord of all, shall deliver the world from this catastrophe. The word translated as catastrophe in several renderings of the Asclepius is closer in the original to turning or reversal, a use that places it structurally next to the Greek concept of crisis, which did not originally mean crisis, as we use it today, but a turning point, a moment of separation and judgment where the cycle changes direction. The apokatastasis, the restoration, is described not as a miraculous interruption of the cycle, but as the cycle completing what it began. The descent returns to ascent. The darkness precedes the light that the light's own law makes inevitable. What makes the historical record significant here is not that it proves the Hermetic model philosophically, but that it offers observable data on how the cycle has operated before. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire is followed, after a period of genuine darkness in which much accumulated knowledge is lost, by the gradual reconstruction of cultural complexity that reaches its articulated form in what is called the Renaissance. The collapse of the Ptolemaic library culture in Alexandria is followed by the preservation of Hermetic texts in Arabic scholarship, which re-enters the European tradition at exactly the moment when the conditions for reception have been recreated. Marsilio Ficino does not translate the Corpus Hermeticum into Latin in 1463 because the manuscripts fell into his hands randomly. He translates them because Cosimo de' Medici had been looking for them. The restoration does not arrive without preparation. It arrives when those who preserve the knowledge through the darkness encounter those who are ready to receive it. The cycle turns where the conditions for turning are met. Where are you on this map right now? The Hermetic text provides specific indicators, not a date, not a prophetic calendar, but observable characteristics of the cycle's current phase. You are watching this video. You are seeking knowledge that most of your social environment treats as marginal, esoteric, or unnecessary. The very fact that this knowledge is difficult to find in mainstream educational contexts, that the Corpus Hermeticum is not standard curriculum, that the Emerald Tablet is known by its most quotable fragment rather than its complete content, is, according to the map, one of the markers of the current position in the cycle. The seeker in the phase of maximum darkness is identifiable not by spiritual achievement, but by orientation. They are still asking the question. They have not accepted the image as the final answer. That orientation, in the Hermetic framework, is precisely what the map is designed to support. Before we continue, if you're working with this kind of knowledge and want to go deeper, the link below this video takes you to the extended material we have developed for serious students of this tradition. It is for people who want the map, not just the phrase. The map is not useful without instruction. Hermes did not leave a cosmological framework that ends with, "Here is where you are." The Corpus Hermeticum is, at its core, a set of instructions for what to do with the knowledge of the cycle. And the primary instruction, the one that appears in multiple forms across the 17 dialogues, is about the nous. The divine mind, the aspect of consciousness that, in the Poimandre, descended through the seven spheres and can, according to the same text, ascend back through them. The first instruction the Hermetic tradition offers for the phase of maximum darkness is deceptively simple. Keep the nous oriented. Do not let it be completely captured by the layers it accumulated on the way down. The Poimandres describes the nous using an image that is worth holding in mind, the principle of divine fire that does not consume and is not consumed by what surrounds it. The nous is not extinguished by its descent into the material sphere. It is obscured, covered. The layers of the seven spheres sit over it like garments that are not the body wearing them. The practical consequence of this image is precise. What you direct your attention toward is not irrelevant. The nous is present. Whether it is oriented toward what is real or toward what is image depends on where the attention is placed. In the phase of maximum material immersion, the default is image, surface, form. The instruction is not complex, it is consistent. Return the attention repeatedly to what is real, rather than to what only appears. How do you orient the nous in practical terms? The Hermetic tradition does not leave this as abstraction. The Poimandre describes the path of return, the ascent through the seven spheres, as a process that begins with the recognition of what is real. Not a single moment of recognition, a practice of repeated recognition applied to everything you encounter. The tradition calls this the cultivation of gnosis, not belief, not emotional certainty, but direct perception. The capacity to look at what is in front of you and ask not, how does this appear, but what is this actually? The question sounds simple. In the phase Hermes described, it is the most consistently difficult practice available, because the conditions of the phase actively produce the conditions that make the question hard to sustain. The image is everywhere. The surface is louder than the depth. This is not metaphor. It is the mechanical description of the cycle's current position. Here is what the Hermetic tradition observes about the difficulty of maintaining nous orientation during the phase of maximum darkness. The difficulty is itself a feature of the phase, not a failure of the practitioner. When you notice that it is harder to stay oriented, harder to hold the distinction between real and image, harder to resist the pull toward the surface, that difficulty is, according to the map, confirmation that you are in the phase it describes. It is not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is a sign that the cycle is exactly where the map says it is, and that recognition changes the meaning of the difficulty. What was previously experienced as personal failure becomes instead navigational data. You are not failing at the practice. You are in the phase that makes the practice hardest. That is precisely when the practice matters most. The law of rhythm is described in the Kybalion, a text that systematically encoded the Hermetic principles for the early 20th century, as one of the 7 fundamental laws of the tradition. But the Hermetic understanding of rhythm is not limited to the individual oscillation of mood, fortune, or circumstance. The Poimandres and the Asclepius together apply the same law at civilizational scale. The cycle Hermes describes, the descent of consciousness, the phase of maximum darkness, the apokatastasis, is the law of rhythm operating across human history. The pendulum that swings toward maximum material immersion swings back toward the original orientation. The measure of the swing in one direction is the measure of the swing in the other. As above, so below. What is true at the level of the individual consciousness is true at the level of the collective. The pendulum swings toward the darkness. It will swing toward the light. The distance from center to maximum darkness is equal to the distance from center to maximum restoration. This is not hope as a feeling. This is the mechanical claim of the Hermetic tradition stated in the law of rhythm, consistent with the description in the Asclepius of the apokatastasis as inevitable. The question the tradition puts to the individual is not, can this be stopped? It cannot, any more than you can stop a pendulum at its furthest point by wanting it to stop. The question is, where do you position yourself relative to the swing? The answer determines everything about what the next phase of the cycle delivers to you. What the initiates of the Hermetic tradition understood about the law of rhythm at civilizational scale was this: you do not fight the swing. You recognize where the swing is, and you position yourself accordingly. The ones who collapsed when Rome fell were those who had invested completely in the forms of Rome, its institutions, its material structures, its surface. The ones who preserved what mattered were those who understood that what mattered was not the form, but the content the form had been carrying. They preserved the content. They let the form go. And when the conditions for new forms arrived, as the law of rhythm said they would, the content was available to fill them. Most people, when they encounter a period of collapse, respond by trying to hold on to the collapsing structure, not from stupidity, from absence of a map that shows what the collapse is and where it leads. The Hermetic tradition is not asking you to be indifferent to what is happening around you. It is asking you to hold what is happening with the context of the complete map, rather than with only the fragment of the map that says, the darkness is bad. The darkness is a phase. It has a direction. It has a next phase. And knowing that changes what you do in the current one. Consider how the Hermetic knowledge survived the burning of the Library of Alexandria, not once, but across multiple phases of destruction. In 391 CE, when the Serapeum was destroyed under Theophilus, a portion of what remained of Alexandria's accumulated knowledge disappeared from official access. But the Hermetic texts did not disappear from the world. They moved. They were carried in manuscript by individuals who understood that the knowledge they held was more important than the institution that had housed it. They were transmitted through Arabic scholarship in the centuries that followed, preserved in a form that would eventually make possible their return to European thought. The preservation was not accidental. It was the deliberate action of people who had the map and understood that the map's instruction during periods of collapse is to preserve the substance and let the form adjust to whatever container the next phase provides. Jabir ibn Hayyan in 9th century Persia, Marsilio Ficino in 15th century Florence, Isaac Newton in 17th century England, each of them working during periods of significant cultural transition, each of them engaging with the Hermetic texts not as historical curiosities, but as operational frameworks, as maps that, in their specific moment of history, provided orientation that nothing else in the available intellectual environment was providing. The fact that the Hermetic knowledge found serious students in each of these periods is not coincidence. It is the law of rhythm operating. The content that was preserved through the darkness arrived in the hands of those ready to use it at the moment when the conditions for its use returned. This is the pattern the map describes, and it is the pattern that is operating now. What the text instructs to preserve during the phase of collapse is not a set of objects or a set of doctrines. It is a capacity, the capacity to distinguish what is real from what is image. This is the one thing that cannot be destroyed by the conditions of the phase. It can only be abandoned. The institutions can collapse, the forms can change, the surface can become completely saturated with image. But the capacity to ask, is this real or is this image, remains available to any consciousness that retains even partial orientation of the nous. That capacity is the inheritance the Hermetic tradition preserved across every phase of darkness it survived, and it is the capacity that becomes most necessary at the point in the cycle where the image most aggressively presents itself as the only reality available. You are already exercising that capacity. The fact that you are here, that you are not satisfied with the fragment, that you wanted the context, that you watched to this point of the video, is evidence that the nous is still oriented. This is not flattery, and it is not a motivational observation. In the Hermetic framework, the orientation of the nous is not measured by spiritual achievement or esoteric knowledge. It is measured by the direction of the attention over time. Where are you directing your attention? Toward what appears or toward what is? Toward the image or toward the substance beneath the image? The fact of being here suggests the latter, and the tradition says that orientation, maintained and deliberately strengthened, is exactly what the phase of turning requires from those who are in it. Hermes did not instruct his students to stop the cycle. He instructed them to navigate the cycle with the map. These are not the same instruction, and the difference between them is total. Trying to stop the cycle creates exactly the kind of investment in collapsing form that the tradition describes as the mistake of those who are swept by the pendulum rather than aware of its movement. Navigating the cycle with the map means doing something entirely different. Reading the phase accurately, positioning your attention accordingly, preserving what needs to be preserved, and keeping the nous oriented through the conditions that most aggressively demand its surrender. Navigate, not fight the darkness, keep perspective on it, not cure the collapse, recognize what survives it, not wait for the virada, recognize it when it arrives. 3 instructions, each one requiring the map, each one impossible without it. The difference between a practitioner who has the complete Hermetic map and someone who has only line 2 of the Emerald Tablet is exactly the difference between these two orientations. One is experiencing the darkness as the end of the story. The other is reading the darkness as a coordinate on a map that also shows what comes next. The apokatastasis, the restoration described in the Asclepius, is not a date on a calendar. It is a set of conditions, and the conditions Hermes describes are specific. The divine principle that generates the cycle restores all things when the cycle reaches the point at which restoration becomes possible. What determines when that point is reached is not a cosmic timer, but a critical mass, a number of consciousnesses that have maintained nous orientation through the darkness and are capable of receiving and transmitting the full map when the conditions for transmission return. The tradition is explicit. The restoration does not arrive for everyone simultaneously. It arrives for those who maintain the orientation that makes it recognizable. What as above, so below instructs as complete practice, not as aesthetic affirmation, but as operational principle, is that the state of the material world is a direct reflection of the state of the collective consciousness operating in it. This is the mechanistic claim of the full Hermetic map, stated in line 2 of the Emerald Tablet and elaborated across the entire corpus. If the material world is in a phase of maximum immersion in image, of surface over substance, of appearance preferred to reality, that is because the collective nous is on average in the condition the Poimandre describes as maximum descent. And if that condition begins to reverse, if more consciousnesses begin to orient toward the real, the map predicts that the material world will begin to reflect that reorientation, not as magic, as mechanics, as within, so without. The inner state generates the outer condition. The outer condition mirrors the inner state. The phrase was never decoration. The Hermetic tradition is not describing a path of spiritual withdrawal from the world. It is describing a path of spiritual engagement with the world that operates on a deeper level than the surface engagement that the phase of darkness promotes. The difference between these two is the difference between the initiate who understood the cycle and the observer who was swept by it. The initiate was not less present in the material world. They were more precisely oriented within it, capable of acting in the material sphere because they were not confused about what the material sphere was and where it was in its own cycle. This is the practical meaning of as above, so below, when read in full. Orientation at the level of consciousness produces orientation at the level of action. The map is not a retreat from the territory. It is a more accurate way to navigate the territory. What do you do tomorrow with what you have today? The Hermetic tradition offers a practice that is as simple as it is consistently demanding. The question: Hermes returns to it throughout the corpus in different forms, but the core of it is always the same. When you encounter something, information, narrative, emotional content, an event in the world, you ask, is this real or is this image? Is this substance or is this form? Is this the thing itself or is this the appearance of the thing? The practice is not about finding the right answer to every question. It is about maintaining the habit of asking. The nous that keeps asking is the nous that maintains its orientation, the one that stops asking, that accepts the image as final without investigation, is the one that the cycle's conditions are designed to bring to exactly that stopping point. Real or image, substance or form, nous or the layers of the spheres, this is the single distinction that the Hermetic tradition places at the center of its complete map. Every other principle, every other law, every other instruction in the corpus points back to the cultivation of this one capacity. The 7 laws in the Kybalion are tools for refining this capacity at different scales. The 7 spheres in the Poimandres are a description of what happens when this capacity is lost and what is recovered when it is regained. The lament of Hermes and the apokatastasis are the same distinction applied to the scale of civilization. As above, so below. As within, so without. As in the individual consciousness, so in the collective. What happens when enough consciousnesses practice this distinction? The Hermetic tradition's answer is not mystical in the modern dismissive sense. It is structural. When enough individual no orientations shift from image to real, from the surface to the substance, the material world, which mirrors the state of the collective consciousness, begins to shift in the same direction. The mirror is not passive, it is responsive. What was reflecting maximum immersion begins to reflect the beginning of the ascent. The pendulum, having reached its furthest point in one direction, encounters the same law of rhythm that brought it there, and begins to move back. Not because something external intervenes, because the law that governs the above and the below equally has reached its turning condition. As above, so below. The turning that happens in the consciousness happens in the world, not as a single dramatic event, as a gradual reorientation that the map describes as inevitable once the internal conditions for it are met. The restoration is not given from outside, it is recognized from within. But the recognition, when it happens collectively, changes the without. As above, so below. This is not wishful thinking. It is the application of the complete Hermetic map to the question of how cycles turn. The phrase that everyone knows is the statement of the principle. What most people never read is the mechanism it describes. The mechanism is the rest of the text. The text was always complete. The map was always available. It was set aside during the phase that the map predicted it would be set aside. That is the precision of the Hermetic tradition that makes it worth taking seriously. It predicted its own partial suppression and described the conditions under which it would become accessible again. The Renaissance offers the most recent completed example of how the cycle operates. From the 9th century forward, Hermetic knowledge survived in Arabic manuscripts inaccessible to most of Europe. In the monasteries and the cracks between collapsing institutions, fragments persisted. And then, in 1463, Cosimo de' Medici instructed Ficino to translate the Corpus Hermeticum. Within decades, the ideas it contained had circulated through European intellectual culture in a way that catalyzed, not caused, but catalyzed, what we call the Renaissance. The knowledge didn't create the conditions. The conditions that were already forming created the receptivity for the knowledge. The knowledge then accelerated the conditions. This is the apokatastasis in historical operation. The map predicted this is how it works. The historical record shows that this is how it worked. You are in the phase of the cycle that Hermes called the darkness before the turning, not as a poetic characterization, as a navigational description. The map places you here, at this position, watching this video, looking for the content that the phase of maximum image saturation has pushed to the margins of general attention. That is not coincidence in the Hermetic sense. The tradition describes the seeking itself as a function of the nous beginning to recover its orientation. The fact that you are here is, according to the map, part of the map. What does the line that follows, "as above so below," say? The third line of the Emerald Tablet reads, "And the miracle of one thing comes from all things, and all things come from one thing by the mediation of one." This is the principle of unity that the full phrase is introducing. The above and the below are not separate realms that happen to mirror each other. They are aspects of one thing. The correspondence between them is not observational, it is generative. What moves in one aspect moves in the other, because they are not separate. The fragment is above, so below. Without this continuation is a beautiful observation. With the continuation, it is an instruction about how to act. You act in the material world, knowing that your action reverberates in the non-material dimension. You cultivate the inner knowing that the outer will reflect it, not as metaphor, as the mechanics of what one thing actually is. The last instruction the Asclepius records from Hermes to Asclepius is about transmission. Hermes says, in substance, transmit this knowledge only to those who are worthy of it, not because others are undeserving, but because the knowledge has no grip in a consciousness that is not ready to receive it. The instruction is not elitist, it is practical. What makes someone ready to receive the map is exactly what you have been demonstrating by watching to this point. The willingness to look past the fragment toward the complete text, the capacity to hold complexity without resolving it into something simpler and more comfortable, and the orientation toward what is real rather than what is merely visible. The Asclepius preserved this instruction across 1,500 years. You are receiving it now. Transmit it to the ready, at the right moment. This is what the chain of Hermetic transmission did through every phase of darkness in the historical record. What Jabir ibn Hayyan did with the Arabic manuscripts. What Ficino did with the Latin translation. What Newton did with his private annotations. Not mass distribution, transmission to those oriented to receive it. The mechanism is not changed by scale. It is the same mechanism at every level of the cycle. The map is transmitted when the conditions for transmission are met. The conditions are met when the nous is oriented. The nous is oriented when the attention is directed toward the real rather than the image. The chain continues. Most people who encounter "as above, so below" will continue to encounter it as a fragment, as a phrase that sounds profound and requires nothing, as a piece of text that fits on merchandise that can be invoked without consequence, that asks the person using it for no further engagement with what it was actually introducing. Hermes described the conditions that produce this kind of surface engagement: the preference for the fragment over the map, the comfortable quotation over the complete instruction. He named those conditions as characteristics of the phase of maximum darkness. He did not name them to condemn the people experiencing those conditions. He named them so that those who had the map could read the phase accurately. Some people will finish this video and carry the map, and the map changes everything, not because you now possess information that others lack. The corpus hermeticum is not hidden. It is in libraries. It is online. It is available to anyone who looks. The map changes things because of what happens when the nous is oriented to use it. Every event you encounter, every narrative you are offered, every piece of information that arrives with the force of, "This is the reality you must accept." You will encounter it differently. You will be able to ask the question Hermes put at the center of the tradition: real or image, substance or form, the thing itself or the appearance of the thing. What you have now, having watched to this point, is not a spiritual credential. It is not membership in an esoteric community. It is a functional map of the cycle you are in, with coordinates you can verify against observable reality, with instructions that are specific and applicable, and with the knowledge of what the text says, not just at line 2, but across the complete sequence. Most people who engage with this tradition encounter the phrase. You now have the map the phrase was introducing. The phrase is the second line of the map. The map continues for another 11 lines and across 17 dialogues and into a description of the cycle that is currently operating. A description more precise and more operationally useful than almost anything else that is available to someone navigating 2026 without it. The nous that is oriented through the darkness, that keeps asking the question, that refuses the image as the final answer, that maintains the distinction between real and appearance, is, in the Hermetic framework, the very thing that the cycle is selecting for. The apokatastasis arrives for those who maintained the orientation through the conditions that most aggressively demanded its abandonment. The people watching this video at this moment in 2026 are not here by accident in the Hermetic sense. They are here because the nous is still oriented. That is the position the map marks as significant, not safe from the cycle, oriented within it. As above, so below is not a declaration of harmony between levels of reality. It is a navigation instrument. It tells you that what you change in the above changes the below, and what you observe in the below tells you about the above. It tells you that the phase of maximum darkness is visible in the material world, and that the beginning of the restoration will also be visible there. It tells you that you are not a passive observer of the cycle, that the orientation of your nous is a contributing variable in the collective consciousness that the material world mirrors. And it tells you that the map, when read complete, transforms a fragment of philosophical aesthetics into an operational instruction set for the most consequential period in the cycle. Hermes did not write for those who preferred the surface. He wrote for those who could still distinguish the real from the image, and who were willing to do something with that distinction that the phase of darkness makes consistently difficult. If you are still watching, you already know which category you are in. The map is in your hands. The cycle is operating. What the text says comes next is not a matter of faith. It is a matter of the law that governs the above and the below equally and without exception. If you stayed until the end of this video, take one moment and write in the comments, "I hold the map," not as a metaphor, as a position. And if this opened something in you that you want to continue, the next video in this series goes deeper into what the Corpus Hermeticum says about the specific conditions of the turning, and what the tradition preserves about how to be ready when the pendulum moves.